If you try to deal with the situation in the heat of the moment, you're probably just as angry as the kid.
If you just say you broke a glass, now here's a punishment, they don't actually learn anything.
So I am curious what you would do in the case of like talking back.
Yeah, there's a spectrum. There's the parent always gets what they want, and then there's the permissive stance where the kid always gets what they want. That's problematic. We need to be able to negotiate and meet in the middle. Get to the root issue, stop hammering down the symptoms, because then nothing gets solved. So, Mark, tell me about your childhood.
Well, I was raised with spanking. I don't remember it being like throughout my whole childhood, so it was only pretty early in my childhood, and that's kind of it. Then I feel like they kind of switched to a more peaceful approach. I don't think it was like intentionally that, but um, that's at least what I remember. But still with kind of spanking in the background, even though they didn't really use it when I was older.
So, would you say it was like a last resort kind of?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, if a lot of the time they weren't using spanking, what were they doing to discipline you?
I don't really remember being disciplined as much. It was more just like telling me what I did wrong and kind of correcting me in that way.
Okay. So, what were some positive aspects of your childhood that you would like to carry forward into your future family?
I'd say a big thing was that they included me in a lot of family decisions. So I always felt like I had a say in what we were doing, even though my parents obviously had the final say. Um, and so it helped me develop like thinking about like money and jobs and stuff like that before other kids were even like knew what that stuff was. So that's something I definitely want to do with my kids is make sure I'm kind of raising them in the real world.
Mm. So, you're raised in a semi punitive environment,
Yeah.
occasional punishment, but not very often. Would you say that now you've moved to more like your parenting philosophy would be more zero punishment? Or do you think would you say there's a time and a place?
I guess that depends on your definition of punishment. One thing I've still kind of am working through, like, and talking with you is like, how do you have consequences for actions? Which, I mean, I guess like if you drop a glass and it breaks, like the consequences is you have to clean it up and stuff like that. So, I mean, that's not really a punishment, but it kind of is. Like, you have to clean that up. So I guess in that sense, I would have punishments, but not like to the extent of like spanking.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting topic is how do you do consequences if you don't do punishment? A distinction that I like to make is there's natural consequences and then there's unnatural consequences. And so I think so an unnatural consequence would be, you know, you talked back and so you get no dessert tonight.
Mm-hmm.
It's like they're not really related, you know. There's nothing about having dessert that has anything to do with talking back. So you're imposing an unnatural consequence. A natural consequence would be you broke the glass and now we have a broken glass, right? And so a natural consequence, like you said, is okay, now will you please help me clean it up? And at varying ages, different conversation and situation will happen, of course. Like you're not going to have a 2-year-old pick up the broken glass, right?
Yeah.
But as they get older and more verbal and can have more complex conversations, I think it's really worthwhile to explain why you should or shouldn't do something, which is just explaining consequences.
Yeah.
And so a big one that I think a lot of parents never really explain to their kids, but they will require it is like clean your room. And if you never tell your kid why they should clean their room, it just seems like a power play. Like I'm just forcing you to do something and I don't really know why. You don't really know why. It's just a thing I force you to do. It's like, if you could explain to your kid why they would want to have a clean room, maybe they'll just clean it, you know?
Yeah.
Or maybe there isn't a good reason for a kid to have a clean room, and maybe they shouldn't have to, you know? And so I think if you're going to require a kid to do something, I think it makes sense to explain why it's important, which involves explaining the natural consequences, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, you could explain to your kid if they were old enough, like 7 or 8 or something, like, yeah, if you break a glass, that means we're not going to have a glass. We're going to have one less. And so that's inconvenient when we have, if we had 6 people and we have 6 glasses, now we only have 5 glasses. Now one's not going to match. And that's annoying. Or, it's dangerous and there'll be broken glass on the floor. And so we should be careful. So we should not put our glass so close to the edge, or we should be careful when we're waving our hands around near the glass. Or so if you just say you broke a glass, now here's a punishment, they don't actually learn anything.
Yeah.
They're not learning, hey, maybe I should not put my glass in this spot near the edge of the table. Maybe I should be careful with glasses. Maybe I should not, throw them around or something. Like, um, all they learn is that, oh, I hate this.
Yeah.
Oh, this was unjust. It was just an accident, and now I'm being punished, and now my stuff is getting taken away, or I'm getting a spanking. Like, now I'm mad.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't think punishment teaches a lesson.
Yeah. So I am curious on why or what you would do in the case of like talking back, because I guess the consequence of that would be like making other people angry or like hurting friendships or just it's more social consequences and like or you're trying to help them and they're talking back, so like how would you go about like uh, going through that process?
I guess it depends what you mean by talking back. I mean, at a very simple level, I think you can explain, like, when you said that to me, it made me feel a little frustrated. I'm a little annoyed. It hurt my feelings a little bit. Whatever you're feeling, like, oh, I feel a little sad. You after you said that, and I think it's important to not blame them, because I think there's a I think things can go on with talking back where a parent just got their pride hurt a little bit, and so they overreact a lot. We just have to be really careful that we're being gentle and loving, being good stewards of these powerless children.
Yeah.
Maybe they were making a legitimate criticism. You know, a lot of talking back or back talk is just, hey, you told me to do this thing, but you don't even do that thing.
Yeah.
Like, maybe they're just calling out the parent on their hypocrisy. Maybe the parent doesn't like that and they have a knee jerk reaction that's sinful.
Yeah.
And so I think you have to be really careful. And you can say, hey, I'm really annoyed that you said that, which is not accusing the child of doing anything wrong. It's just letting them know, hey, that kind of stung a little bit. And if they are doing something that is like blatantly harmful or hurtful, you can explain to them, hey, let me explain to you all the reasons why that could hurt someone,
Hmm.
why it could hurt their feelings. And I might even go through the collaborative problem solving, the 3 steps. So one, hey, I've noticed you've had this problem with talking back or calling names or whatever it is, and not in the heat of the moment, by the way, at a
Yeah.
different time. Um, and just tell me what's up. Tell me what's going on. And they could say any number of things, which is really useful information. Well, maybe I was really mad that you did this, or I just feel so like you're not paying enough attention to me, or I feel like my brother is the favorite one and you never listen to me, or you're just being a hypocrite. You tell me to do something and then you don't do it. Like, who knows what they're going to say, and we need that information.
Yeah.
And then 2 is, well, let me tell you my concerns. Let me tell you, if this keeps happening, what's going to happen, right? And number 3 is, let's work together to find a solution we're both happy with. And so you could really take any behavioral problem and use that framework. and both people will end up being happy because you both get a say in it, and you both get the ability to veto a solution you don't like.
Hmm. And I guess with active defiance, that would uncover like the actual problem instead of just like pushing it further down
Yeah,
into probably more defiance down the road that could actually have harm.
right. And what we don't want to teach our kids is when you have an emotion, what you should do is you should bottle it up and
Yeah.
shove it down deep and ignore it and pretend it's not there.
Yeah.
And if you ever show me that emotion, I will punish you. That is not what we want our kids to be doing. We want them to be openly vocal about their emotions and teach them how to tell us about what they're feeling in a gentle, loving, calm way. Because we need to know if they're angry. We need to know if they're upset or frustrated. Maybe there's something going on that we don't notice. And of course, there will be. And their input is very valuable and we need it.
Yeah.
So, you were raised in a punitive household. What changed your mind to kind of leave spanking behind?
So, I mean, it kind of something we've talked about is like I was raised that way, so that's kind of why I went with it.
Yeah,
But really looking back at it, like once you gave me those questions, is like um, it really um, I feel like they did have a more peaceful approach. Like initially it was spanking, and then as I got older, it transferred more to like working it out with me, which there was still always the like threat of being spanked. But uh, I feel like I never really want to spank my kid. Like, so if I can go about it and like, if most of my life I wasn't spanked, if I can have something that gets me to that same place but without spanking, like that's worthwhile to me.
I think that's where a lot of people are. Is they don't love the idea of spanking, and if they had an alternative, they would use it, but they just have never heard of an alternative, or maybe they've heard of timeouts, or maybe
Yeah.
just taking away privileges.
Because the other thing is I've seen other families do like the timeouts and the like, oh, don't do that, and like that'll hurt someone, and it's like that doesn't work because you're still not solving the problem. Like if you're just let the kid get away with it, which is like um, when we first talked about this, that's kind of like the position I thought you held. So that's where I was arguing with you on it. Is like you're just letting the kid get away with whatever they want, but like it, but with but now that I know more about your position, it's like you're actually fixing the root issue and not letting the kid necessarily get away with it, but you're not shifting it onto like if you do this, I'm just going to punish you no matter what. And still, that's not fixing the issue.
Yeah, yeah. There's the spectrum.
Yeah.
There's the parent always gets what they want, right? And it kind of ignores the child's perspective. You must do what I say, which is kind of an authoritarian stance. And then there's the permissive stance where the kid always gets what they want and the adult always just bows to the kid and, oh, you want this, okay, fine, I'll give it to you. And that's problematic.
Yeah.
We need to be able to negotiate and meet in the middle, which is both people have their concerns heard and met, right? And so that is a common misconception when people hear, oh, don't spank. Oh, so you just let them do everything? No.
Yeah.
Like we still have reasonable expectations, and we don't bend on them. We'll just, it's how we solve our expectations to also have our children's expectations met as well.
Yeah. And I think it also it takes effort from the parent to realize you're not always right. And I think that's a big thing I've seen in other families is like, well, I'm right, so get over it.
Yeah. And then something else I wanted to touch on, like when you have spanking as a last resort, or, I hope I don't have to use it, but I'm willing to if I have to. I think an analogy that might be helpful to understand what that's like for the kid is it's an extreme analogy, but It's extreme to prove a point. So imagine a guy is asking a girl out, but if she says no, he's willing to kidnap her.
Hmm.
It's like,
Yeah.
no, she has the full choice to say no, but then I'm going to use violence. It's like, okay, she really doesn't have the choice. Like, you're not actually, like, it taints the whole situation. And the girl can obviously sense this is not a real choice. Like, something spooky is going on.
Yeah.
And so if you're saying, hey, Johnny, you got to clean your room now. And Johnny will be able to know, okay, if I say no, punishment is coming.
Yeah.
Like, it's obvious from their perspective and just tone, and they've spent every day of their lives with you, so they know your personality and your intonations and what you mean and what's happened before. And so I would say you really can't have spanking as a last resort. It just doesn't work because of that reason.
Yeah. And yeah, I would say that's definitely a case in scenarios, especially when I was younger. Just like knowing like if I don't do this, like there's that threat of punishment. The threat of spanking was always usually involved in like active defiance of like my parents.
Yeah, I think a lot of kids will say no, but they don't mean no.
Yeah.
Or they're just kind of experimenting. Like,
Yeah.
their parents have told them this word all their life, and they're just like, what if I say it? It doesn't have to be, I am disrespecting your authority. It could just be like, wait, does this work for me too?
Yeah.
That I don't think that's a sinful thing to just, hey, people say this to me. What if I said it? You know? And so when you realize maybe it's not active rebellion, maybe it's, and that's what happens when you punish is you don't find out.
Yeah.
You don't find out what they're thinking. Um, and so when you use the collaborative approach, you say, hey, I've noticed you've been saying no more often. Can you tell me what you're thinking there?
Hmm.
Maybe they'll tell you some valuable information. And and then you can, as a parent, get a chance to explain to them, well, these are my concerns if you keep saying no, right?
I feel like I can refute the ones in Proverbs, but like what verses are you pulling from for your methodology?
Sure. Well, let me ask you a question. What verses in the Bible say that you shouldn't hit people or use violence?
Uh, I guess none.
I don't know.
Like none come to mind.
Jesus says if you hate someone in your heart, that's just as good as murder,
Yeah.
right? So the commandment, thou shalt not murder, is kind of a commandment. You shouldn't be violent and you
Yeah.
shouldn't steal. That's a commandment. So if you take away someone's privileges, or you take their toys or their things, you're stealing from them. Kids have a right to property just as much as we do.
Hmm.
You know, um, it raises the question: where do we get our rights from?
Yeah.
Does the government give them to us because they're nice? I would argue what gives us our rights is because we're made in the image of God. And because we're made in God's image, we deserve to be treated in a certain way that honors God. And so, like, I think the right to property, dogs don't have the right to property, but humans do,
Yeah.
right? Just as much as adults have the right to not be harmed or assaulted, children have that same right because they're also made in the image of God. And so to hit a child would be to deprive them of their right to bodily autonomy.
Hmm. Okay.
And then there's the aspect of how does God treat us as his children? What can we learn from the example of God the Father? So I think something the Bible is very clear on is that God is extremely patient and merciful. It's not every single time that we sin that bang, we're smited and God sends us to hell.
Yeah.
Like, God is the God of second chances, and he's the God of waiting patiently year after year after year, hundreds of years, generations. God will wait for his people to repent. And in a similar way, we can be patient with our children. And just because they do one little sin doesn't mean we need to pour out our wrath on them. And we're not the judge of our kids. Ultimately, God is the judge. And so all we're here to do is to guide them, to disciple them. That's where the word discipline comes from, is disciple. And so if we are patient with our kids and realize that we are responsible for all their influences, for where they go to school, for who their friends are, where they go to church, who their mentors and teachers are, they aren't responsible for who influences them, but we are. And so if they were influenced by a bad influence and made a poor choice, that's actually on us, not on them. And so if we punish them for a choice we made, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So I think we should be patient with our kids and understanding and take some responsibility.
Yeah, I think that's a good point because, like, also kind of looking back, it's like things I noticed in like other families is a lot of punishment was kind of both ways. It's like the kid was acting out, but the parent wasn't responding in a way that was going to like diffuse the situation or have anything beneficial. And it's just, I'm done with this, so go stand in the corner.
Yeah. And it doesn't really make sense to say, you hit, it was wrong to hit, so now I'm going to spank you,
Yeah.
right? Or you're not, you ran out of patience and did something foolish, and now I'm out of patience. It's like you're expecting a small child to have more self control and maturity than a grown adult who chose to
Yeah.
have children. So I think it's important to take responsibility of that and be understanding that they are acting their age.
Yeah.
And if they don't have self control, that's a skill they need to learn. It's not something all people have and they just choose to turn off. Like, children's brains are literally still developing, and they need to be taught the habit of how to react when you feel certain ways.
And hitting people is not the reaction you want.
Right. Violence is not the solution, and we don't want to teach them that it is. So, a common objection to peaceful parenting is people will say, well, I was spanked and I turned out okay. I turned out fine. Um, and both you and I were spanked and we turned out fine, right? And so, what would you say to that objection if someone said that to you?
I think that's applying like an outcome to something very specific of like spanking. I was only spanked like very early in my life. I think to attribute me turning out the way I did to spanking is kind of short-sighted of like my parents did so much other stuff like reading the Bible with me, like talking with me, spending time with me, and encouraging me and stuff like that, and discipling me. Um, I think to ignore all of that and say I was spanked, so that's why I'm okay. It's like that just doesn't make sense. That just one very specific thing would have such a big impact, and that if we can take something that I don't think anyone really wants to hit their child. If they do, that's kind of a big issue. Um, like if you can take something that's like that seems kind of bad and replace it with something that is going to further those other things of discipling your child, raising them in faith and leading them towards God, like I think it would be silly to not look into that.
Yeah, like maybe you turned out okay in spite of being spanked,
Yeah.
or, and it's not like we had a controlled experiment here where we had one one mark that was spanked and one mark that wasn't spanked.
Yeah.
And they're in the exact same environment. And one turned out a little bit better than the other, or a lot better. And it's like,
Yeah.
we don't have that. So there's no controlled experiment. We can't pin it on one thing, right? So, what biblical principles would you say guide your parenting philosophy?
I guess like the main thing is just raising the kid in the path of God so that they won't depart it in the future or when they grow old. That's 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 my end goal. I don't really have. like specific like biblical principles other than just like doing what Jesus did, like just being the best example I can be to my kid and try to show them like sounds silly, but what would Jesus do?
It's a great question,
Yeah,
and I think that's really important to set the right example, because there's a saying, kids learn things better caught than taught.
yeah,
They'll catch things and they'll pick up on things by observing it and kind of trying it for themselves. And I think we have an instinct as people to kind of just do what everyone else is doing,
yeah,
just kind of go along with the crowd and not stand out. If everyone else is acting a certain way, we'll just naturally flow in that way. And yeah, I think learning by example or setting that example for our kids is so essential. And especially when you're setting the tone for the whole house, oh, we act like this, great, and it's not just saying we do, but actually acting like that.
yeah. And it really calls the parents to live to a higher standard, which I think a lot of people like maybe subconsciously struggle with.
Yeah. And a big verse that I think a lot of people kind of glaze over, but really could learn something from is, in Ephesians 6, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger. How many parents, when they're punishing their kids, are provoking their children to anger?
Yeah,
Like almost all of them, I would think. Like, how many children sit there and say, yeah, I think yeah, that's reasonable. That's totally fine. And how many kids are like, what do you mean? Like, that's so unfair. Like, he was doing this thing. And what do you mean? Just me and you do it too? And all these things that come out. It's like, if you sit there and provoke your kid to anger, you're just directly disobeying that verse.
yeah,
And that's like the one verse in that whole passage. They talk about how you should treat your kids. Children, obey your parents. Fathers, don't provoke your kids. Like, give one instruction, just don't provoke them. And I think if you're listening to them, you'll be a lot better at not provoking them.
yeah. And kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, like if you're in an argument with a kid and they're like an argument takes two parties, as if you're not actively trying to diffuse the situation or like understand what's going on and you're like to keep the argument going, you have to be like actively provoking your kid.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of subtle things that lead to arguments. Like, I like to say there's always 500 ways to say the same thing,
Yeah,
and the way you pick matters, right? And so, like, kind of like I was saying earlier, you can say, after you did that, I felt a little frustrated. Or you can say, you made me so mad. Or you just, like, this was the biggest sin you just did. You lied. Or, like, you could say it in a whole bunch of ways. And so when you accuse someone or implicitly accuse them, or explicitly, like if you just say, you talked back right there, or, I don't like your attitude right now, it's instantly making them defensive because they feel
yeah,
attacked. So instead, if you either just let it go, circle back later, then they won't be as defensive. Hey, I noticed you felt pretty strongly about this one issue. Can you tell me what's going on? That's a lot less argument inciting or antagonizing or provoking. And so I think there's a way to talk about issues and concerns and conflicts without instigating and making them defensive. And when they feel defensive, then they lash back and say, well, what about you? And I think it's our job as parents to diffuse and not escalate.
yeah. I mean, one of the big things that kind of stands out to me that you talked about is waiting till later, because it's like if you try to deal with the situation in the heat of the moment, you're probably just as angry as the kid. It's not a good time to be teaching them.
Right? Yeah. And also, it gives you a chance to think about it for a few minutes or for a second and just say, Well, is this actually a pattern of behavior? Is this something that is consistently happening that is concerning to me? Or did you just do it once? How often, as parents, like adults, do we get tempted by something and, maybe I shouldn't eat the ice cream. Maybe I should be really healthy. Maybe I shouldn't do X, Y, or Z. Maybe I shouldn't make this little comment to my spouse. And then you do. It's like, what would you do to yourself? How do we treat ourselves? We give a lot of mercy to ourselves. We say, "Oh, I was feeling this in that way, and I'll get it right next time." We don't need to be like slammed down by the hammer of justice every single time we choose a poor decision.
Yeah.
And so I think if you're constantly making comments to your wife or constantly giving into junk food or whatever your temptation is, that's something we should look into at that point, but maybe not with the swift hammer of justice, maybe with some care and caution and concern, because obviously this is a touchy issue
Yeah.
and there's something going on. So let's shine light in the darkness in love and be open minded and not, yeah, just be open minded and gentle.
Fix the root issue.
Yes, exactly. Get to the root issue, stop hammering down the symptoms because then nothing gets solved.
Yeah.
If I could give one message to parents that I would want them to hear, I would say punishing never solves the root issue. Punishing always assumes the problem is motivation and tries to motivate the kid.
Hmm.
But motivation is almost never the actual issue. A lot of the time, or almost always, kids want to do the right thing, but for some reason they haven't learned the self-control. They haven't learned the decision making, or they don't understand why it's an important decision. They want to make you happy, but they also want something else, and there's a battle that goes on in their mind. And it's not that they're not motivated enough, it's that there's a skill that's lacking that they need to be taught, that they need to learn and practice. So yeah, punishment doesn't teach them that skill.